Scott C. Core. I am a health service psychologist here in the state of Oklahoma, and I am the director of Renew Counseling Center, which is a part of Southern Nazarene University, and a professor in the graduate programs in counseling there. And I am glad to be with you for what we're calling Mental Health Minutes. We're making these 10-minute digestible information sessions about different mental health topics that we hope get you curious about how to intervene with mental health and understand the different factors that potentially lead into suicidality. I spent one of my predoctoral intern years at the Department of Veterans Affairs Hospital here in Oklahoma City, and my father was a member of the Air Force, so I really have a passion for working with our military veterans, and glad to be with you sharing some of these topics. Our first topic today is going to be the power of the unconscious, and I start with this one because I think it's very important to understand how powerful our unconscious is. So that's today's topic that's going to set the table for some of the other things that we're going to watch over the next several months. So today, the power of the unconscious starts with a person named Thomas Huxley, who wrote back in 1874, essentially saying that man is mostly automata, is what he called it. And essentially what he meant by that was that man has free will, but that free will often operates at an automatic rate because it essentially has to. If we had to think about everything that we had to do all day long, we probably wouldn't get a whole lot done. And so what Huxley started to hypothesize that a lot of human decision is often determined by our automatic responses that are not as much up to us as we like to think that they are. And Sigmund Freud built a lot off of that. Most of us has probably heard of Freud. He's a famous psychiatrist that worked a lot in the unconscious, and he developed what was called this iceberg theory, that essentially said a lot of our instincts, kind of our fears and our selfish motives, come from that unconscious process. He kind of called it and linked it to an iceberg, where essentially it's underneath the water in ways that we can't see and often cannot access. And then he kind of considered the preconscious, which is where our memories are often stored. So it's a little bit higher up before we get to the conscious part, which is kind of what our thoughts and perceptions are. And in today's day and age, as we've gotten into neuroscience, we've actually been able to kind of prove some of Freud's theories and kind of look at where in the brain this is located. So, that conscious mind, that rational thought part, is more of our frontal lobes, which is, interestingly, the last to develop in us as human beings. And so that is not kind of the primary focus when we come out of the womb in a lot of ways. It's going to be more of those primitive areas. So that unconscious and preconscious mind is the part of our minds that is buried deeper in the brain. And so all of our mental processes in the unconscious are often inaccessible to the conscious mind. And the reason this is important is because a lot in my experience as a therapist and a psychologist is finding that people often do things that they don't always have access to in terms of why did they do what they did. If you've ever asked your kiddos, why did you do that? And they don't have a real good response for it. Well, part of the reason is because it's coming from probably more of this buried part of the brain, the unconscious, okay? And the unconscious is going to contain processes. They're not available to introspection. So it's really hard to know why we do what we do. It's hard to get access to those points. So there are therapies that actually work quite a bit in helping people access that. But what's interesting is a lot of our memories, our feeling states, even some overlearned skills. So if you know how to do something at a really high level, it's become repetitive in a lot of ways because you learned it at this kind of unconscious level and you don't have to access it anymore. So driving, for example, you don't necessarily have to think about what you're doing all the time when you're driving. You're just kind of doing it repetitively, the motions. And so this is not necessarily in our immediate awareness. And the reason that this whole idea is important is because a lot of the things that get us into trouble when it comes to mental health in terms of despair and problems are things that are often happening and associated with feelings that we don't always have access to. And so this is why we care about this. This is kind of the point of this whole idea, is that a lot of our habits and our automatic behaviors are determined by these unconscious processes. Okay, so a lot of what we do happens outside of an awareness in some ways. Okay. And in fact, there's a part of the brain called the amygdala that attaches emotions to a lot of memories. And it's very raw and unfiltered. And a lot of times what happens is it's going to attach emotion to things that don't always connect rationally. Like, why am I upset about this? We may not always know, but our brains, our amygdalas in particular, are saying this feels very similar to something I've experienced before, and it's going to react out of it. So some of the point of this too is that a lot of our despair, a lot of our suffering can often result from these automatic, outside of our awareness processes that cause us to feel particular ways, and we often don't have access to it. And I actually find that a great deal of mental health distress, I often feel like almost 90% of it is because we see what we feel, not what we see. And what I mean by that is we often aren't always taking in the environment in rational, vision-based ways. And I say this to say that there's a lot of studies that come out that a lot of the reasons that people misperceive things and see things in very what we call idiosyncratic ways is because that amygdala part of their brain, that emotion-based primitive part, is feeling it instead of seeing it. And our occipital lobes, which actually process vision, is offline at this point. So we're actually projecting onto a situation rather than fully seeing it. And that can be good at times. It can help us. It can be protective. But if we do it a lot, it can cause a lot of long-term issues. So what's the cure in some ways? Well, I would say if we can access that unconscious. A lot of my work as a psychologist is how to access it. If we can create connections with those feeling states and start to understand why we're feeling what we're feeling and seeing what we're feeling as well, it can give us more creative solutions, because that primitive part of the brain is a very useful creative element also. And if we can pair that with our frontal lobes, our conscious parts, and start to access that more easily, we learn how to cope differently and see situations more holistically instead of just feeling them and reacting to them. Well, how do we do that? How do we access that? Well, I'm a therapist, so obviously I'm going to advocate for therapy, of course, that really helps you learn how to self-reflect and helps our folks learn how to understand themselves. I always tell my students that we're not listening to stories in therapy, we're listening for stories, which means that ultimately I'm looking for themes to my stories, okay? And how I can understand how to self-reflect on why I do what I do. Some of the other things we can do are very simple things, like mindfulness-based techniques of breathing and being present. Yoga therapies and body therapies can really help us start to become present and understand our feeling states and start to integrate mind and body and get us to a place where we can actually have access to those unconscious parts. So some take-homes in our first kind of 10 minutes here of this Power of the Unconscious, our mental health minutes. I want us to learn that acknowledging the unconscious is important. Again, most of what we do is outside of our awareness because it has to be. That's our brain's ability to adapt to constantly incoming stimuli, and we need that part of our brains. And so what we want to do is start to listen to those instincts in some ways, and we need to evaluate how accurate they are. If you've been someone who's been through a lot in your life, trauma or just a lot of negative elements in your life, it's going to be hard to really trust that part of your instincts. Is it telling me the truth or not? And so as we can pause and reflect on what we're feeling, we can start to evaluate how accurate those instincts are. And then we can start to look at those two from a curious perspective instead of a self-recrimination. One of the best things I like about therapy is we get to get curious about the self, but not beat ourselves up. And if we can get to that point, we can start to use that unconscious for creative reasons. And I would say this too, I think all of us can use someone to talk to get into therapy. So one of the biggest precursors for folks that get into trouble, particularly with suicidality and suicidal thoughts, is they try to carry it on their own. They try to carry the weight themselves and they don't reach out for help. And so relationality, particularly the relationality that can be found in therapy, can be very helpful for that. So I hope this has been helpful to understand the power of the unconscious and how, again, it can be used for good and sometimes not so good. And if we can learn to access it and be more kind to ourselves, we can find healing. Thank you for listening.